Hello everyone, it's 11 o'clock, so we will get started. Welcome to our first virtual Fall Forestry Field Day. Today we have a series of 4 videos for you, as well as some live speaking sessions, and there will be opportunities to ask questions in between the videos, as well as again at the end. We ask today that you please keep your microphone and video muted. That helps the program run smoothly. So you can see here at the bottom of your screen, you should have a mute option for both your camera and your video. That means that you will be able to see and hear us, but we won't be able to see and hear you, so there won't be any interruptions. In order to ask questions, we ask that you submit those through the chat box. So you can see the chat function here. And if you click that button, you will be able to type your question in. That will come to me, and I will read the questions off for the speakers to answer. With that, I thank everyone again for being here, and I will hand things off to Billy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. This is the 42nd annual Shimek State Forest Fall Forestry Field Day. My name is Billy Beck. I'm the Extension Forestry Specialist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I am very excited about this virtual event. We've got some amazing speakers and some really relevant content today. We're going to be visiting 3 sites, discussing oak management and wildlife habitat associated with each site. And bonus, we have compiled a resource sheet for you all. So watch for that via email after the event. It'll have all kinds of supplemental information about the sites you're seeing today. A ton of people I want to thank today for making this possible. You, of course, for taking a little bit out of your day. Taking a little bit out of your day to visit with us. The Iowa DNR, all of our great speakers, our host Julia Baker. There's a lot going on behind the scenes here, and we really appreciate her efforts hosting this today. Whitney Weisiger and Janet Smith from Southeast Iowa, Iowa State University Extension. The crew down at Shimek, Heath, Ben, and Eric. And of course, the engine that makes it all run. I will pass it off now to John Bird, Area Forester at Shimek State Forest, and let's enjoy the day.
Hello, everyone. John Bird, Forester at Shimek here. Real quick, I want to just tell you a little history about Shimek. Shimek was named after one of Iowa's earliest conservationists, Dr. Bohue Shimek. He was instrumental in convincing the state to purchase, overpastured, degraded farmland so it could be protected. In fact, in 1935, he allowed the state to get the CCC into our state, which the CCC ended up planting over 1,000 acres into pines and native hardwoods. Today, Shimek is a demonstration area on how to perform proper forest management. And one major goal of the forest is to maintain and gain oak on the landscape. This is accomplished by introducing disturbances such as prescribed fire, management thinning, shelterwood, and clear-cut harvesting. These disturbances are very crucial to oaks because they need full sunlight in order to occupy the site. Today in this presentation, we're going to show you some of those disturbances that involve harvesting in an even age management system. Myself and the other presenters will take you through a shelterwood, clear-cut, and goal achieved in even age management. Wildlife experts will also be sharing how these management decisions affect birds and other wildlife. On to the bird conservation areas. Shimek's actually in 2 bird conservation areas. The Shimek Bird Conservation Area has roughly 7,900 acres in it. And also the Lacey Keosauqua Lake Sajima Bird Conservation Area. There's about 940 acres in that. So with that, we'll continue on with the program. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, John. Now we will head off to a video that shows our first site, which is a shelterwood.
Hello everyone, John Bird here, Area Forester of Shimek State Forest. Right now I'm standing in a shelterwood harvest. And basically a shelterwood harvest is you remove a certain level of the canopy layer. As you can see behind me, it's a little shady, but there's still some sun coming down on the forest floor. And basically we don't remove all the canopy, because we want the residual canopy trees to shelter the regeneration still on the forest floor. So 3 years ago, what we did in here was we removed some of the canopy layer of the oak, ash, hickory, and other trees. 8 years before that, we also removed all the understory. As you can see behind me, it looks pretty thin. This understory that was removed was anything from 1 inch, which is pretty small, to 10 inches, that is fairly decent size. And we want to do that 5 years before the harvest so that any oaks on the ground right now get a little bit more sunlight to start growing. Now, oaks have to have sunlight to become established. And right now they're not getting full sunlight, but they can survive in a little bit of shade before they start disappearing from the landscape. So we're starting that little bit of sunlight right now to get them going. So in 7 years from now, what we're going to be doing is looking at the stand again, making sure we have enough regeneration that if we cut all the canopy trees out, that we will be able to have enough oak regeneration to sustain the site for hundreds of years. Now, if we come back here and we do not see that regeneration enough, right now we have roughly 7,000 per acre oak regeneration by our preliminary plots. So if we come back here and a lot of the shade tolerant species such as ironwood, elm, bitternut hickory, ash, etc. start to overtop the oak trees, we can run prescribed fire through here. And then 7 years from this date, what we kind of go into then is the steps to do a clear-cut harvest. We already have the oak regeneration available that we need, and now it is time to remove the overstory trees so that what is on the forest floor now can become our next forest.
Hi, I'm Adam Jenke, Extension Wildlife Specialist with Iowa State.
And I'm Anna Buckhart-Thomas, the avian ecologist with the Iowa DNR.
And we're going to explore today how wildlife respond to the vegetation structures that foresters create by the various silvicultural practices that they use.
In the shelterwood, you'll notice that there are 2 distinct structures of habitat layers. So there's a canopy layer that's maintained after the harvest, and then there's all this new growth that's happening coming up from the sunlight that's been allowed through the canopy. And those 2 distinct layers allows for 2 distinct cohorts of birds. And so some of the canopy birds that were in the mature forest that occurred here before harvest are still maintained in the canopy. Things like eastern wood pewee, scarlet and summer tanagers, yellow-throated vireos, all will stay in this canopy structure. But now we've allowed the light to come in and the new regeneration to happen, which means that we can have a second cohort of birds, things like eastern towhees and common yellowthroats, that might come in and start to colonize this lower vegetation layer. So because we have a diversity of layers and structure in our habitat, that means we can have a broader diversity of bird species that use it. Also in this habitat, you'll notice that there are dead trees, which we call snags, and those are really important features for wildlife. So dead trees provide important foraging for things like woodpeckers and nuthatches that will eat bugs and insects on dying and dead wood. And they're also important for cavity creation. So birds like chickadees and woodpeckers find dead trees and excavate a cavity that they use for nesting. And so having those dead trees on site and having trees that are large enough for cavities to be within them is really important for these different wildlife species. Additionally, there are some species that can't build their own cavities but still require cavities for nesting. So species like the eastern bluebird and the great crested flycatcher are secondary cavity users, and they will use these sites that chickadees and woodpeckers have already excavated. So both of those features make this habitat a really great place for wildlife.
The same things that create good bird habitat in a shelterwood harvest are also the same things that create really good habitat for other species of wildlife. Namely, when we're in southeastern Iowa, we like to think about bats, and all 9 species of Iowa bats are really adapted to this open forest canopy structure that shelterwoods create. Other species like southern flying squirrels and other small mammals also like to take advantage of the oak forest and the cavities and dead trees found throughout. And then of course the mass produced every year, both with fleshy fruits and hard mass like acorns and hickory nuts, is really important food for wildlife.
Now we have time for some questions. Yeah, look in the chat. Our first question is, would prescribed fire be done in this area after management?
Yeah, Julia, basically prescribed fire is just another management tool, and we can use it if we start to see those shade tolerant or the shade loving species start to overtop our desired oak regeneration. What we can do is we can run fire through there in the shelterwood, because there will be fuel to run one. And what that does is it will eliminate a lot of those not as fire adapted species as oak. Oak's root collar is more under the ground and can handle fire, but things like ironwood, bitternut, etc. cannot. So it really knocks them back, and it helps you get a jump start on the oak. So yes, we can.
Thank you, John. We've got another one here. How did you come up with those per acre oak regeneration numbers?
So a lot of forestry is estimating, because you can't walk through the whole timber and just count every seedling. So what those numbers were is what we call a 1,000th acre plot. So if you take roughly a 7.5 foot diameter circle, which is more manageable, and count the seedlings in that area, you just take your number times 1,000, and that's what your regeneration is. So 7,000 means that we found 7 oak seedlings in that plot. Now, of course, you want to do that over the whole area so you get a better estimate, but in that area, yes, it was 7,000.
Thanks, John. Again, I want to remind everyone that you can type your questions into the chat. Adam sent a message out to everyone to help you locate that. When you type your message in, you can type and then press enter, and that will get that off to me. We have another question that came in asking about biochar. Can any of our experts speak to that?
Hey, Julia. The only thing I'll say about biochar is if you shoot me an email, there's folks on campus doing intensive biochar research. So That is kind of out of my realm of expertise, but if you do email me, my contact will be at the end of the, on the resource sheet that we provide. Give me a shout and we can talk about, I can get you the answers to biochar there.
Thanks, Billy. We have time for one more question. This one's for the wildlife people. Are there birds that don't like shelterwood management?
I'll take a stab at that one. So there are some bird species that may have been in the canopy layer before harvest that won't necessarily stay there after a shelterwood. So species like Acadian flycatcher, who really like dense, really full canopy structure with mid-story as well. So an Acadian flycatcher probably wouldn't stay around. An ovenbird is another species. They, again, like that full canopy cover, but they actually nest on the ground. So a shelterwood would potentially discourage them from using the site. But there are, like I said, there's this nice diversity of species that some new species will come into the understory, and a lot of those canopy species will still find it suitable moving forward after shelterwood.
Awesome, thanks, Anna. Now we're ready to move on to our next video. So we will see a clear-cut site this time.
Hi, I'm Ray Lane, District Forester with the Iowa DNR. I'm standing in the midst of a beautiful 10-acre clear cut on Shimek Forest. The difference between this site and the previous shelterwood site is that the overstory canopy has been removed. Now we're getting nearly 100% sunlight hitting the forest floor. Whenever you open up the forest floor to sunlight, the existing vegetation is going to respond. As you can see from the abundant woodland flowers and forbs, the hazelnut, the raspberry, these plants are flourishing. Fortunately for us, we also have 7,000 to 8,000 oak seedlings, along with 1,000 or more hickory, ash, walnut, and other species. They're all taking advantage of this full sunlight. This site looked like the previous shelterwood site prior to the overstory being removed. And the fact that we have 7,000 oak seedlings growing here is no accident. This site received the same site preparation, the same cultural practices, the shelterwood cut to thin the overstory and the understory killing to remove the understory so that we had full sunlight to the site. And the results, we now have a young forest. I would call this an unmitigated success. You might not be able to see all the seedlings in here, but they're here. We got some of them marked with these stakes. So I think all we basically need is time to let this forest mature, and for the next 200 years, we'll probably have an oak forest here. One thing about oak seedlings, particularly white oak, is that they're a little slower growing than some other seedlings. So some of the hackberry or elm or whatever else is growing here might outgrow some of the oak. So what we'll do on this site next, probably in 7 or 8 years, is come in and evaluate this and see if there's any of these oak need some help. It might involve some killing of the less desirable species.
The big advantage of using clear cutting as a management strategy is that it allows a lot of sunlight to reach the forest floor. And because of that, we get a lot of regeneration of both woody and herbaceous plants. And a lot of those plants have fruits and berries on them, so things like raspberry and blackberry, cherry, Dogwoods and native honeysuckles all produce berries that are really great fruit and food for a lot of wildlife, especially birds. So birds like American robins, gray catbirds, and cedar waxwings all have a very fruit-heavy diet. And so they use these habitats because of this open area that allows all those fruits to grow. These areas are also really important for birds that sometimes, or all the time actually, they nest in mature forests like you see behind me. And so these birds that nest in mature forests will come with their young, once their young can fly, to these habitats to forage before migration. And so these habitats are really important for foraging for birds that even don't nest in this space. The light also creates this really dense regeneration of both herbaceous and shrubby plants, and that creates a very solid cover. And that's important for a lot of nesting birds. So things like American woodcock and blue-winged warbler nest on the ground or very close to the ground, and so it's really important to have dense cover to protect them from predators. So this site, again, is really helpful for wildlife because of all that sunlight.
For the same reasons that Ray and Anna talked about, the early successional areas with abundant sunlight are really productive for a lot of wildlife species, especially pollinators and other insects. If you pause in this beautiful clear cut here in southern Iowa, you can hear that it's just alive with the humming of a diversity of insects here in the late fall, taking advantage of all the floral resources created by the abundant sunlight that also creates all the food for other wildlife and creates the conditions suitable for oak regeneration. We also know lots of other wildlife come here to feed and raise their young. That's true of bats that, although they of course live in the forest, love to feed on in open areas over forest edges, and other species of wildlife like white-tailed deer and a diversity of small mammals and even some reptiles and amphibians take advantage of these unique ecosystems in a matrix of forested environments.
We have questions already coming into the chat. Please continue to submit those. Our first question is, if you have garlic mustard, will the oak seedlings survive?
I think that question, there we go. I was wondering if we were going to get our foresters back.
Sorry about that. So yes, with garlic mustard, I think thought it was a bigger problem than it was when it first came on many years ago. And while we see some forests getting infested with it, it is definitely something to minimize and keep out wherever you can. We really don't see it completely stopping oak regeneration. It's certainly, again, one of the things that's ideally not there, but not nearly as bad as some of our larger shading shrubs that are going to completely shade out our oak seedlings. They're still able to grow through even some of those infestations.
We have another question about the clear cut. It was mentioned that the clear cut opens the site up for a lot of sunlight, and so a lot of shrub species can come back. Does this cause issues with invasives like honeysuckle? And would all of the shrubs inhibit the growth of the oak trees, again, with the regeneration? Or can the oaks overcome this shrub growth?
So that's where we go back to some prescribed fire. Now, oak seedlings, they do have some intermediate shade tolerancy, so they will grow through a little bit of shade. I've seen them grow through shrubs. I've seen them grow through multiflora rows. Now, when you start getting honeysuckle coming in, so these sites here did not have honeysuckle in them when we cut them, so it's not a big concern right now. But there are sites that do, and you need to utilize fire where you can to keep those suppressed. We have done some basal bark spraying to target only some of those, but that's pretty labor intensive. So oaks will grow through some of that stuff, and actually it makes them kind of shoot up a little bit faster towards the sun. So not all species in there is a bad thing. The shrubs are great habitat. That's why the oak hickory forests are so one of the most diverse forest types on the planet.
John, we have another question for you. So if you just want to stay right there. What is done to prevent deer from browsing on those oak seedlings?
Ah, the old deer question. So basically, my theory behind deer is kill them with kindness. So that's why when we say X amount of seedlings per acre, you know, right along with deer, we also have to worry about rabbits as well. They are can be hard on trees as well. So what we try to do is we try to get as many oak seedlings per acre as we can get, because you know they're not going to be able to kill them all or nibble them all off. And the thing with that is oak tend to establish their root system first. So they might kind of grow slow in their infancy. And then after a few years, when they have a good root system there, all of a sudden they're going to shoot up. And then that will take them above the deer browse line. So you kind of just, you need to kill them with numbers, basically, is the theory behind that.
John, could you also talk about the harvest at Shimek? I think maybe when we think about private landowners, they may need to remember that harvest is an important component of managing deer populations and also working with neighbors to think about how you manage deer densities.
Yeah, I don't do a lot with, you know, managing deer densities and stuff like that, but with your harvest, you know, especially clear cut, you're going to create bedding areas and a lot of, you know, open areas where once you get light to the forest floor, it's going to start exploding with a bunch of different shrubs and other things, nasty things like multiflora rose too. So basically, the goal behind it is just as many numbers as you have out there, you kind of let the deer thrive. As a private landowner, this practice is still, you know, a viable practice. And you'll see in the next video that it's a clear cut later in its life, and it was only 5 acres. So even with smaller landowners that don't have much, the disturbances are absolutely crucial.
And to clarify, I wasn't speaking very clearly. I meant deer harvest. Just a point that deer harvest is allowed at Shimek State Forest, and there's probably higher pressure on deer there than we find on many private lands. And that could be something for private landowners to just remember, that it's important also to manage deer populations as well.
Good point, Adam. Yes, all of Shimek Forest is public hunting. And I stay out of the woods both shotgun seasons, by the way.
We do have a few more questions in chat, but I'm going to move us on to the next video. For those of you who didn't get your questions answered yet, we will have plenty of time at the end to get to those and after the following video. So continue to send them. Thank you. Now we have a mission accomplished site where you can see what happens after these first 2 steps.
Hi, I'm Bob Petrozelka. I'm a consulting forester. Earlier you heard John talk about how we start this process to regenerate oak here in Iowa. John talked about the prep work we do as far as killing competing vegetation, and then he walked us through the shelterwood harvest process where we tried to get some advanced regeneration. And then Ray Lane showed us a site that was down the road from that where we had established that oak regeneration. And now we were coming in for that final harvest, which we called the clear cut. Now I'm standing on the site where we're 10 years further down that process from what you saw at Ray's site. This stand behind me was cut 13 years ago. It was clear cut. And almost all the trees you see behind me are oak. We have some excellent regeneration here. There's two things I really like about this site. The first is the stem count. So when John and Ray took population samples at their sites, they were both still maintained at 7,000 seedlings per acre. Here we've lost some of those, but we're still down to the mid 3,000 range. And the reason we lose some is because they just get outcompeted by their neighbors. So as trees get larger, there's only so much sunlight and water and nutrients on any acre of ground. So as trees get larger, you get fewer and fewer trees per acre as the survival of the fittest takes hold. But that's still plenty of seedlings, and the reason that's important is because having a lot of stems gives you that nice form as they're competing with each other. It forces them to grow straight, and it's what we're looking for to establish oaks. Another thing I really like about this site is the diversity of species. There's at least 5 different oak species here, probably more, and then there's some other hardwoods that are associated with that, like 2 species of hickory, some hackberry, there's some walnut out here, there's some black cherry and elm. There's also some ash, but they're probably not going to be here long term. The reason we like diversity of species is because growing trees is a long-term project, and it's not like growing one crop and harvesting it next year. 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, I don't think we had not heard of emerald ash borer, and now we used to focus on ash as one of our primary species here in Iowa. Now we really don't focus on it at all, except to try to do some salvage harvest and burn it for firewood. So that's why you want a diversity of species, so you have things to choose from going forward. The other thing I like about here is that we have the different species of oak. So right here is a black oak, there's lots of white oak, there's some red oak, and I think 2 others, probably some swamp white and bird down in the bottom. So the only thing this site has had done to it since that clear cut 13 years ago was 3 years ago, John's crew came in and cut down and girdled some of the larger non-oak species that were competing with the oak. The reason they did this is because oak tend to be a slower growing tree compared to some of the other species. So things like cherry, maybe some hackberry, elm, even some of the ash were girdled so they would not overtop the oak. What's the next thing to do? We're probably looking at maintaining another 10 years before we come in here. At that point, you're going to again make sure that the oak are not being overtopped by competing species that are faster growing. You might even, within the oak species, have to cull out some of those. Black oak and red oak tend to grow faster than the white oaks. So just to maintain white oak as a major component of the stand, you may have to end up killing or favoring the white oaks over some of the faster growing oak species. Further down the road, say in 30 years or so, you would come in here, and at that stage they'd be approaching what we call small sawlog diameter size. And at that point you might even be able to harvest some. But let's see, trying to think 30 years from now, so 39 plus 30 is 69. I'll probably be retired by then, so you'll have to work with another forester to get that one done. But not everything foresters do is always successful, but in this case, super happy with how it turned out and mission accomplished.
So you'll notice that in this clear cut 13 years later, we've got a very different structure of habitat than what we find pretty soon after clearing. So we still have some of the same species, but we're starting to get more closed canopy and the light is being blocked. So we're starting to get a little bit shaded. Right now, we're in sort of a transitional habitat. So we don't have the canopy species that we had in the shelterwood, and we're losing those young forest early successional species that we had in the clear cut. So at this middle stage, we probably has less diversity overall than in either of the 2 previous habitat types that we visited. But what we do have is all of this really great regenerating oak. And that means down the road, 10, 20, 30 years, we're gonna have wonderful mast with acorns, which provide important food for things like woodpeckers, blue jays, and wild turkeys, as well as other wildlife species like white-tailed deer. And additionally, oak are a really, really important species for wildlife because they also support a wide diversity and abundance of insects. And so the birds that will eat the insects will have plenty of food here. So this may be a really great spot to stop or nest in a few years, but right now we're kind of in a transition zone where we don't have high diversities of either type of species right now. This site is also not necessarily ideal for bats at this time. Again, we're transitioning. It's not open enough for them to forage, and the trees haven't become big enough for them to really use for roosting. But again, down the road, this oak forest is going to be really great habitat for wildlife.
I think we briefly touched on this in this video, but there was a question that came in about preventing maples from predominating. If you wanted to just speak to that real quick, John.
Yeah, maples is one of those species that is extremely tolerant of shade. So you can have very little sunlight coming in and they'll still thrive. Maples are a tough one. So your management might have to be a little more severe if you have maple coming in. So you probably will do your understory work, such as cutting everything out 1 to 10 inches, but then you're probably going to be utilizing prescribed fire a little bit more, just because little maples will just keep showing up. So maples one, if you have in your woods, you would definitely want to stay on top of it and probably monitor more often than if there is not maple in there.
John, you mentioned prescribed fire. How do you guys control that fire?
So prescribed fire, basically in the woods, it's pretty low intensity. Unless you have relative humidities down in the 20s or below, then you start getting some pretty good action with the fire. But if you burn in 30 to 55% relative humidity, really a 3-foot burn line down to mineral soil will generally contain that. So we put burn lines in, we use roads, we use trails, we use creeks, ditches, things like that. So really it's finding the day when the weather works for the fire is probably one of the biggest things. Now in the fall, you're going to get a little more action because when the oak leaves fall, they tend to fall down and cup up, which is perfect for getting airflow and the fire really to go. So the fall, you can get a little more, fire erratic behavior in the fall. Spring is a little less after the snow is settled, the leaf packed down, and it's not quite as intense either.
We're talking about a lot of management today, and we're getting questions about what would have happened historically when we didn't have foresters out there managing these areas. What stopped these oak hickory forests from just turning into a bunch of shade tolerant trees?
Hey, that is a great question, and that's the reason for this is because history, before there was foresters, all that, there was wildfires and fires that were set by lightning, Native Americans, just to keep some of this stuff down. That's what we mean by disturbances. So before settlement, fires would start in the prairie and they would just keep burning through the timber, maybe until they hit a stream or river or something. But they would keep those intolerant species down. And then if you would have a pocket of oak die, those fires keeping the shade tolerant species down would allow the oak to come up in those dead canopy spots. So because we have suppressed fire, because we have the general society thinking clear cuts are all bad, but oak needs that disturbance. So by taking disturbances away, actually what we've done is we have altered the environment from what it naturally was. So that's why we need to have drastic cutting measures, prescribed fire, things like that.
Are there any aerial images that people can see of the forest? This question specifically asked about drone footage. I don't know. We didn't take that on our field recording day, but I don't know if you guys have any of that.
Actually, you know, all the foresters have a program called ArcMap GIS, and we get, whenever they do aerial flights, we can get aerial photos of the land in Iowa. Now, the public can also access some of these photos. What I do is in a search, I will put in ortho GIS, and that will take you to a site where you can actually, I think it's through Iowa State, where you can actually look at aerial photos, and probably aerial photos up to 2019, probably 20 coming up. You'll be able to see some all different kinds of hill shade, LiDAR, infrareds, natural, all that stuff. Drones actually probably in the next 10 years will become a part of our management too, just for looking for health problems, I would say. But we're still in the infancy of that on the forest right now.
We'll move on to our next video now. Thanks everyone for answering questions.
Hi there. So my name is Lisa Lauk, and I'm going to say just a few words about forest health to get the conversation started with just this brief segment. We just wanted to introduce our two most important recommendations when it comes to forest health. So, and what we're looking at here is twofold: is the management, the regular and proper management. Some of those that we saw today with the harvest practices that John and Ray and Bob went over. And then the second arm of our forest health management is going to be monitoring and kind of regular monitoring. So what monitoring might look like is walking through your forest a couple times a year during the growing season and just seeing what's up there, what is dying, what might look a little bit peaked or not quite right, and kind of keeping an eye on that. Julia, you can go ahead and throw up that slide whenever you get a chance. And something important to say about these major recommendations is whether or not we're talking about oak wilt, whether or not we're talking about managing around our dying ash from the emerald ash borer, whether or not we're talking about something as devastating as the derecho event, these recommendations would be the same.
What street are you on?
So what we're looking at here in this first picture is just a really typical oak wilt tree in the middle of the forest. And so the ideal situations, taking those two main premises into account, if we encountered this in our forest, is one, ideally we would have noticed it right away through our monitoring. When we do that, we're going to be able to not only say that that has died, but also to look at the surrounding trees to make sure there isn't any more dead. Then the other thing that we're going to be looking at in something like that is that we're going to hopefully, ideally, have already been managing in there. Ideally, you would have gone through a few years ago and cut out some of those dying and suppressed black oak trees that could have just been the harbingers for more oak wilt to spread in a more dense and less healthy stand. Ideally, you would have been keeping on top of the invasive species that were coming in. So there wasn't a lot of honeysuckle and multiflora rose to take advantage of that forest opening. Hopefully we would have started looking at some of that oak regeneration. Julie, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. All I'll say about that is those are just some leaves that Billy and I were able to see on the ground around that oak wilt tree just a couple of weeks ago. And so midsummer, you're looking again for discoloration of trees or some of those different things that don't look quite right. And even if we don't know what they are right away, we can start to address them and keep an eye on them. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is the great packet that Billy has put together for this field day. There's a couple of good publications in there that Mark Vitosh out of the Iowa City District put together called In the Forest and in the Towns, and it goes over some of our kind of general things that were happening in forest health this year. And then also our DNR Forest Health page has a lot of links and different things. And if you've never checked out the Iowa ISU Forestry Extension webpage, they have just a myriad of things available to start to narrow down what might be going on with your forest health issues.
Thanks, Lisa. Sorry, I got my order mixed up here. So that was our live presentation from Lisa on forest health. And next, we will have Gretchen talk to you on a timber market update.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to just kind of briefly go over what we're seeing in our timber markets right now. Also included in your resource packet is a list of the species by what we're seeing for board foot prices, and that's under Woods Run. And Woods Run is encompassing the species, all grades and sizes. So when we talk about what we're getting out of the forest in a white oak tree, when someone calls into our office and asks about how much is my white oak tree worth, it really all comes down to quality of that individual tree. So if it's a low grade tree with a lot of knots on it, it will be pallet grade in most cases, which is a 10 cents a board foot price. It could go up to lumber grade prices, which is 60 to 80 cents a board foot, again, for just white oak. And then a stave market white oak would be $1.50 a board foot. Or if it had lumber grade in that log, it could go up to $3 a board foot. So Woods Run is taking in that spectrum of low and high end. So a lot of folks had asked about how COVID has affected our timber prices. And we did 4 sales that opened last week, our company, and we saw a lot of interest from different buyers on those sales. And a lot of, those prices were great. So what is going really well right now? Walnut, white oak, and silver maple, I would say, but all prices are fine. It's just that's what they're really looking for. COVID really didn't affect our lumber industry. It was deemed essential, so it kept trucking on through that whole period. And prior to that, the tariffs, I would say, affected our lumber prices more than the actual period that we're in now. Tariffs from China, which is where we export a lot of our logs to, started requiring fumigation that needed to happen in the States before those shipping containers went overseas. And that kind of backlogged a lot of those shipping containers, and it added a lot of costs. So profit margins were lessened for our buyers here in the States. Keeping in mind a lot of our lumber goes over to China and comes back to us in the form of furniture. So, we're getting it all back in a lot of cases. It just is where it's being manufactured. So I'm making sure and with COVID, the biggest thing that's happened, I would say there was a lag in payments. So when our, manufacturers in Iowa or loggers are sending their loads of lumber off, they're not getting paid right away. There's just a little bit of a lag, which they had set up in advance because some countries are still closed. Some countries are having a hard time with importing. So that's kind of the biggest thing. But again, it really has not affected our prices very much at all. I know that derecho is also something that came up, and there were questions about that and how it's affected markets. It's such a localized thing that overall it really didn't impact our timber markets. And there's such a spectrum of how that affected the timber. Some of it has been just completely devastated and really hard to even get into access to salvage harvest. And I've seen other windblown tops and much easier to get to, and you could still salvage it. So it really just depended on where you were at in that line of storms. So I think overall, I would say the outlook is fine. We're good right now. If you're looking at possibly doing a harvest in the future, it's a good time to do one. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen. Now we're ready to move on to a video. This video is going to cover a networking and resource opportunity that is available to private forest landowners. There's a group that we will be interviewing here called the Iowa Woodland Owners Association.
Hi, I'm Billy Beck, Extension Forestry Specialist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach.
I'm Ed Kokel with the Iowa Woodland Owners Association.
All right, we've seen today how critical active management is to our forests in Iowa. So we really wanted to highlight an exceptional resource and networking opportunity for private forest landowners in the state, and that is the Iowa Woodland Owners Association. So we're really excited to have Ed Kokel here representing that group, and I'm going to ask Ed a couple questions about the Woodland Owners Association. And Ed, thanks again for being here.
Thank you for having me.
First off, what is the Iowa Woodland Owners Association, and how would you describe its overall mission?
The Iowa Woodland Owners Association is a group of individuals in the state who either own woodlands or just have an interest in trees. Currently, we've got about 400 members statewide.
Excellent. So I know there's a lot of folks out there that are not participating in active forest management for a variety of reasons, but what would you tell those folks as far as the value they would see or the return they would see from actively managing their forest lands?
Yeah, well, management is key, and if you could get in there and come up with a management plan and do that, stick to that management plan, your benefits are there are many benefits.
So not just economics, but all the kind of things we've talked about today, such as wildlife and even water quality, recreation, it's almost unlimited. So
that's correct. You know, besides harvesting trees, you also have all of the other benefits that go with it. And again, management is key to get the maximum benefits out of your property.
Excellent. So there's a lot of folks out there too that may be interested in managing their forests, but they just might not know where to begin. It's quite a daunting task looking at it from the front end. So what would you tell those folks about the value of joining the Woodland Owners Association and what kind of returns they would get as a part of membership?
Yeah, first off, I would suggest joining the Woodland Owners Association for $25 a year. We publish a newsletter 3 times a year that's very informative, and we also have at least 2 field days a year around the state where people can actually go see what people are doing with their woodlands, and they could visit with these people firsthand and look at the practices and get ideas on what they could do on their properties.
Yeah, from my experience, it's an exceptional networking opportunity, not only amongst forest landowners, but with the Iowa DNR and private forestry consultants as well. So, excellent. Well, yeah, at the end of this field day, we're going to have a resource sheet, so please check out the link to the Iowa Woodland Owners Association on that. And Ed, thank you once more for coming, and again, thank you all for attending.
That concludes our video and speaker portion of the event today. We do still have lots of time for questions. We do have some questions here waiting in the chat box that I will get started with. How do you recommend controlling Ohio buckeye?
Yeah, Ohio buckeye, buckeye is a shade tolerant species, and it can be pretty prolific in spots. You know, it's one of those things you treat it similar to what you would any other tolerant species. Is you're going to have to watch it. Now, when you do understory work, like I've said with the 1 to 10 inch stuff to get light down there, you need to use chemical. We use chemical on all species except for if we are cutting oak, walnut, maybe if you find a unique species like mockernut hickory, those ones we don't want to kill, so we'll cut them close to the ground to let them resprout. But when you get to the buckeye and other species, you want to make sure you use herbicides such as Pathway, 50% Roundup. I know some people use a Garlon mixture too, but you know, monitoring is the way to kind of keep control of some of those species.
We did have a question that came in from the previous section. And that one was, are there any trails for side-by-sides?
No, there is not. We have hiking, biking, and equestrian trails.
We're getting a lot of thank you messages, so I'd like to share those with our speakers. That wraps up the questions that I have. We have about 4 minutes left today. So I'd like to hand it off back to Billy, and he will tell you about the follow-up information.
All right. Thank you, Julia. And again, thank you all for attending, and thank you a million to our speakers for participating today. Again, keep your eyes open for this resource sheet. We didn't have, I'm sure you had more questions swirling around your head, maybe didn't get a chance to type them out. Check out the resource sheet. There's a lot of info in there pertaining to the content we covered today. So, and context too. And again, if that doesn't answer your questions, feel free to contact myself. I can get in touch with the other speakers or answer them directly. So also, we're going to be sending out an evaluation for this event via email as well. So that data is critical for us to improve and make sure our message is being heard and to see how impactful these events are really. So to sweeten the pot there, we're going to have every evaluation we get back, we are going to enter your name in a drawing for a chainsaw chaps, or a hard hat. So that will again hopefully encourage you to provide that much needed data for us. So last thing, we have 2 more virtual forestry field days coming up this fall. Check the link below and in the resource guide to kind of keep tabs on those. October 20th is the Yellow River State Forest Virtual Field Day, and October 29th is what we're calling the Iowa Forest Showcase. We'll be highlighting a variety of forest types around Iowa. So with that, again, I want to thank our host, Julia. I want to thank y'all for attending. I want to thank our speakers, and we have a special goodbye from the folks in Southeast Iowa that you unfortunately couldn't see face-to-face this year. So with that, again, thanks. Billy Beck saying bye, and I'll hand it over to John and the Southeast folks.
Thanks, Billy. Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully next year we can watch Bob make a fool of himself again. But thank you very much. Goodbye. Again, if you have any questions, look at the resource sheet.
Thanks to Iowa Learning Farms and ISU Extension for making us look so good, except for John.
Thank you.